Just a temp. That's what Dr. Mercer called her in the hallway outside room for 12, loud enough for the nursing staff to hear. These temp agencies send us anyone with a pulse. Just a temp who thinks she knows better. Rachel Torres didn't flinch. She didn't look up from the medication cart she was restocking. The fluorescent lights above Cedar Creek Medical hummed their endless mechanical prayer, and she kept moving, kept working, kept invisible, the way she'd been trained to be invisible for the last 15 years. What Dr. Mercer didn't know was that Rachel Torres had performed 17 emergency field thoracotomies in Bagram under active fire. What he didn't see when he glanced past her in the corridor was the 3-inch scar across her knuckles from disarming an insurgent at point-blank range, or the way her eyes assessed every room's exit points in under 2 seconds, cataloging the distance from any door to the nearest cover. What he absolutely didn't see was the faded Navy SEAL unit patch sewn into the lining of her jacket, Task Force 88, Naval Special Warfare Command, the only thing she'd kept from 12 years of service. She was a ghost in grey scrubs. That was the mission. That was the point. The double shift had started at 0600, and Rachel moved through the pre-dawn darkness of the ICU with a kind of quiet efficiency that made her easy to overlook. Cedar Creek Medical in Raleigh had 17 floors and 314 beds, and she knew every corridor like muscle memory. Her hands were steady as she pulled the medication cart down the hallway, the wheels barely whispering against the tile, past the nurses' station where 2 younger RNs were trading complaints about their student loan debt. Neither looked at her. Nobody ever looked at Rachel Torres. Room for 12 was at the end of the east wing, the last corner unit with a view of the parking lot and the rain-slicked streets beyond. Through the small window in the door, she could see him, Admiral James Harrison, United States Navy, 63 years old, admitted 3 weeks ago with 5 bullet wounds from a Bagram convoy ambush that should have killed him. Should have. The arterial repairs had held. The surgeons at Cedar Creek had done good work. But infection risk was climbing, fever already at 101.8 the night before, and his chart read like a countdown. Rachel pulled the chart from the rack and entered the room with movement so practiced they barely registered as conscious. For line, heart monitor, ventilator running at 60% oxygen, all of it catalogued in the 2 seconds it took her to close the door behind her. The Admiral was sleeping, his breathing shallow and irregular, his left shoulder bandaged tight. She checked his vitals with fingers that knew exactly what pressure to use, what angle to approach, how to move without waking him. Captain, that was her rank, though nobody here knew it. Captain Rachel Torres, United States Navy, 8 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, 1 Medal of Valor she'd never told anyone about. Now she was a temp nurse making $15.50 an hour. The morphine dosage on his chart made her stop. Her pen hovered over the line where Dr. Mercer had noted 15 milligrams for Q2H for pain management. She'd seen this pattern before. 3 other patients on the ICU floor had similar dosages, all ordered by Mercer, all significantly higher than standard protocol for post-operative pain management. Her jaw tightened. She knew what she was looking at. She'd reported financial fraud before. She'd testified in federal court before. But that was a different life, a different identity, and those doors were supposed to be closed. She adjusted Admiral Harrison's for line anyway, her fingers moving with the precision of someone trained by the best trauma surgeons in military medicine. The saline dripped at exactly the right rate. His oxygen sat was 94%. Stable. For now. You're writing on that chart without authorization. Dr. Mercer was in the doorway. He was tall, immaculate in his white coat, his shoes polished to a shine that must have taken money and time. His name was embroidered on his coat pocket. His watch, she registered this in half a second, was a Rolex. His voice was the kind that had learned to command rooms in expensive schools, and it carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never been told no. Rachel set the pen down and turned to face him. Just noting the time of the last vital check, Doctor. Temp nurses don't note anything. Temp nurses follow protocol and stay in their lane. He moved into the room, and the air pressure changed the way it changes before a storm. I've been a physician for 31 years. I think I know how to manage a post-operative patient. Yes, doctor. She held her composure the way you hold your breath underwater. Steady. Controlled. The trembling in her hands from the 0600 start time, the exhaustion that came from running operations at night and stacking papers during the day, she locked that down deep where it belonged. He looked at the Admiral's chart, at Rachel, at the 4 lines she'd just adjusted. His eyes narrowed. And I don't appreciate temp staff second-guessing my orders. Cedar Creek has standards. Understood, doctor. For words. Soft voice. The perfect subordinate. Inside her chest, something that had been trained to handle the weight of command, the weight of lives depending on her decisions, folded itself smaller and smaller until it fit inside the skin of a frightened temp nurse. He left without another word. The door swung shut behind him with a soft hiss of hydraulics. Rachel stood in room for 12 for exactly 7 seconds, she counted, and then she returned to her work. Admiral Harrison's chart needed to be reviewed every 2 hours. His fever was climbing. His infection markers were worse than the night shift had documented. And Dr. Mercer was ordering morphine at rates that made her stomach clench because she recognized the pattern, recognized it the way you recognize a face that's haunted your nightmares for 3 years. This was Medicare fraud. This was a physician systematically overcharging federal insurance programs, padding patient records, running dosages through the roof on patients who couldn't monitor themselves or report him. She'd seen it before. She'd built cases against it before. She'd sat in federal court and testified under oath while her hand stayed perfectly still and her voice didn't waver. But that was Captain Rachel Torres of Naval Special Warfare Command. That woman didn't exist anymore. That identity was sealed in a file somewhere in the Pentagon with her real name redacted and her service record classified. The person who existed now was Rachel Torres, temporary ICU nurse, contract position, no benefits, no questions asked, exactly what her handlers had ordered when they'd pulled her from Bagram with a bullet still lodged between her ribs and told her to disappear. The next patient needed her vitals checked. The medication cart needed restocking. The 4 fluids needed monitoring. She moved down the hallway like a ghost, like smoke, like someone whose most important skill was being invisible, and she didn't let herself think about what she'd seen on Admiral Harrison's chart because that way lay complications, and complications were the last thing her handlers wanted. What she didn't know yet was that Admiral Harrison's eyes had cracked open while Mercer was in the room. What she didn't know was that he'd watched her stand there in the face of that cold dismissal, and that something in the way she held herself, the posture, the precision of her movements, the absolute control of her breathing, had registered in the part of his brain that had spent 37 years in the military. The part that recognized soldiers when they were standing right in front of him. The fluorescent lights hummed above her as she moved through the corridor, and 3 hours after her shift began, before anything else happened, before the bleeding started, before the doors burst open in the middle of the night, before the Admiral's entire unit showed up in dress uniform, she was still just a temp nurse folding scrubs in the supply closet, her hands moving through muscle memory, her face calm, her mission intact. The rain started at 0720. She could hear it hammering against the windows of the stairwell, sound like distant gunfire, like the weather itself was trying to tell her something. Rachel pulled a fresh set of scrubs from the shelf and began folding them with the kind of precision that came from years of military deployments, where every movement mattered, where efficiency was survival. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she could feel something shifting. She could feel the mission starting to unravel. The Admiral had seen her. Dr. Mercer was paying attention. And in a job where survival depended on being nobody, on being the person nobody remembered, on being the temp who made no impact, she was becoming visible. She had 3 hours before everything changed. The room went dead silent at 1,100 hours. Dr. Mercer entered Admiral Harrison's room during family visiting time, his white coat crisp as a guillotine blade. The Admiral's daughter Sarah sat beside the bed, holding her father's hand, a gesture that made the room feel smaller, warmer, more fragile. Rachel was adjusting the morphine drip downward when she heard his voice cut through the monitors like a scalpel through flesh. "Nurse Torres, are you questioning my prescribed dosages?" Rachel turned slowly from the four stand. Her hands were steady. That was the first rule of survival, never let them see the tremor. Doctor, the patient's respiratory rate has dropped to 8 breaths per minute. Protocol requires assessment before. Protocol. Mercer's face flushed red like a warning light. You're a temp nurse with a community college degree. I graduated Johns Hopkins. He took a step closer, his presence filling the small room the way smoke fills a hallway, suffocating, unavoidable. Perhaps if you'd spent less time learning from YouTube and more time respecting actual physicians, you'd understand pain management. Sarah Harrison's hand tightened around her father's. The Admiral's jaw clenched. Rachel could see the muscle working beneath his weathered skin, the calculation happening behind his eyes, a man used to command, forced to lie silent in a hospital bed while a doctor spoke down to the staff keeping him alive. Rachel took one measured breath. In through the nose. Hold for 4. Out through the mouth. That was breathing technique taught at Bagram, where the air itself felt hostile. She blinked once, and a single tear escaped, not from fear, not from shame, but from the specific anger of watching someone competent be diminished by someone corrupt. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact. I documented everything, doctor. The words landed like a surgical strike. Minimal. Precise. Devastating in their restraint. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply stated fact, and in that fact was a promise. There were timestamps, vital sign recordings, and a written record of what Mercer had prescribed versus what the patient's physiology actually needed. She didn't need to say the rest. He heard it anyway. Mercer's face darkened another shade. Get back to your assignments, nurse. He turned away, but not before Rachel saw his hands clench at his sides. She had made him feel something he wasn't used to feeling, threatened. Not by her rank, she had none. Not by her credentials, they were modest. But by her certainty, her documentation, her refusal to perform the role he'd written for her. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A monitor beeped rhythmically. Outside the door, a code was being called 3 floors up, distant, manageable, somebody else's crisis. Rachel returned to her charting, her handwriting steady as a surgical laser, every vital sign recorded with exact timestamps. The Admiral's eyes followed her. His daughter still held his hand. Behind them, a poster showed a sunset over mountains, meant to calm patients but somehow making the sterile room feel even more artificial, more temporary. At lunch, Rachel entered the break room carrying her meal, a container of rice and vegetables she'd prepared that morning. The conversation died. All of it. Mid-sentence. A resident talking about his rotation in dermatology just stopped, his mouth closing like a trap door. A charge nurse suddenly remembered she needed to check on a patient. A surgical tech grabbed her coffee and left mid-sip, leaving a pale ring on the table where the cup had been. Rachel sat at the corner table and ate methodically. One forkful. Chew. Swallow. Another. The fluorescent hum seemed louder when she was alone. Outside the break room door, she could hear voices resuming in whispers just out of range, fragments that didn't matter. The tone said everything, she was radioactive now. She had challenged Mercer, and in the careful ecosystem of a hospital where hierarchies were more rigid than any military structure, challenging authority meant isolation. By 1500 hours, her name appeared on the unit's disciplinary board. The letters were written in thick red marker, the kind used for urgent alerts. Rachel Torres, written warning, insubordination, questioning physician orders. The board hung in the hallway outside the charge nurse's station, visible to every staff member, every visitor, every person who passed through the ICU corridor. A public record of her supposed transgression, displayed like evidence at trial. The charge nurse, Margaret, wouldn't meet her eyes when Rachel walked past. Margaret, who'd been kind during her first shift, who'd shown her where the good coffee was, suddenly had urgent business with the medication cart whenever Rachel approached. Dr. Mercer stood near the board with an intern, speaking loud enough to carry. Some people just aren't cut out for real medicine. Temps think watching ER makes them qualified. Next thing you know, they're convinced they know better than physicians who've spent decades studying. He laughed. The intern laughed. It was the kind of laughter designed to spread, to confirm what everyone was supposed to think about the woman in the corner, the one nobody knew. Rachel's jaw tightened. The muscle worked once, twice, then stilled. She didn't respond. That was the real discipline, not the written warning, but the choice to remain silent when every nerve ending in her body wanted to speak. But speaking meant revealing. Revealing meant exposure. Exposure meant her mission ended before it started. She headed back to Admiral Harrison's room to chart his vitals. Her hands moved through the routine without thought: blood pressure cuff, pulse oximetry, temperature. All normal. All documented with timestamps that would survive any audit, any investigation, any tribunal. The Admiral watched her work. His daughter had gone to get coffee. For a moment, they were alone. He didn't speak. Neither did she. But something passed between them in that silence, the recognition of two people who understood the cost of doing the right thing when nobody was watching. At 18:20 hours, the ER doors exploded open. The motorcycle had lost its fight with a light post on Fayetteville Street. The rider, 19 years old with handlebar tattoos and a leather jacket that smelled like diesel and rain, came through on a stretcher with blood streaming from his left leg like a faucet someone had forgotten to turn off. Rachel heard the call from the ICU unit clerk, heard the code go out, and watched the controlled panic that followed. She was pulled from the Admiral's room. Short-staffed. Surgical experience on her CV. The only available option. She didn't protest. This was exactly what she'd trained for, and the moment her feet hit the trauma bay floor, every mask she wore slipped sideways. The surgical resident's hand shook as he tried to clamp the spurting femoral artery. His fingers kept slipping in the blood, bright red blood that meant arterial pressure, meant minutes, meant the clock was counting down to a place where no amount of Johns Hopkins training could bring someone back. The attending surgeon was stuck in traffic. Just the resident and 3 nurses who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Rachel moved without asking permission. Her hands found the pressure point, index and middle finger pinching the vessel itself, thumb providing counterpressure from below. The bleeding stopped. Not gradually. Instantly. Like turning a valve. An older surgical nurse named Patricia froze mid-suture prep, staring at Rachel's hand position. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, "You served," Patricia whispered, her voice barely audible over the cardiac monitor. "I used that exact method in Kandahar. That's not something you learn in nursing school." Rachel's jaw clenched. Her focus stayed locked on the bleeder, on keeping the pressure constant, on maintaining the arterial seal with the precision that came from 15 years of field medicine, from having done this while explosions shook the ground beneath her feet. "I need 4-0 silk, now," Rachel said. Patricia didn't move. "That's a combat medic clamp." "Who are you really?" Rachel finally met her eyes. Her voice had changed, dropped an octave, lost every trace of the deferential temp nurse who'd been written up an hour earlier. "Right now I'm the person keeping this kid alive." "Suture." Patricia's hands moved. She didn't ask again. The attending arrived 10 minutes later and took over the repair, praising the initial clamp work, never asking who'd performed it. Rachel stepped back. Her hands were steady. There was no adrenaline shake, no trembling, just the specific calm that came from having already survived worse than this. Much worse. She returned to the ICU as evening fell across Raleigh, the city lights coming up like scattered flames. Admiral Harrison was sleeping. His daughter had gone home. Rachel checked his vitals, documented everything, and sat for a moment in the corner chair that nobody else used. Patricia knew. And Patricia would ask questions. And questions meant her cover was fraying, thread by thread, stitch by stitch. But the Admiral was alive. The kid downstairs would keep his leg. And that, for now, was enough. The ones who have seen the worst often give the most. The surgical bay doors crashed open at 1820 hours, and the motorcycle lay on its side down the hallway like a broken toy, chrome still spinning. The rider followed 30 seconds later on a stretcher, his left leg twisted at an angle that made geometry impossible, his abdomen lacerated from hip to ribs, the kind of damage that kills men in under 4 minutes if you don't move fast. Rachel was pulling bladder scan readings from the ICU when the overhead intercom crackled. Trauma activation, level 1, motorcycle versus sedan, ETA to OR in 4 minutes. The charge nurse's eye swept the unit and landed on her. Torres, you're with us. We're running skeleton crew tonight and I need someone who doesn't panic when arteries bleed. Rachel set down her tablet without hesitation, already moving toward the scrub room. She'd done this before. She'd done this 1,000 times before. Just not in Raleigh, not in a hospital, not as a temp nurse named Rachel Torres who'd never existed before 6 months ago. The surgical suite hummed with the particular urgency that separated controlled chaos from actual panic. For surgeons, 3 nurses, 2 anesthesiologists, each moving in their own space but aware of everyone else's position, the way a military unit moved through a compound, no wasted motion, no unnecessary communication. The patient was already prepped, chest exposed, ribs visible under the lights like ivory keys. The trauma surgeon, a woman with grey threading through her black hair and the steady hands of someone who'd seen the worst the world could offer, glanced at Rachel once. I need someone to manage the arterial bleed in the lower abdomen while Dr. Hayes works the thoracic. You done this before? Rachel nodded, already pulling on a sterile gown, the latex snapping against her wrists like a snap to attention. Yes. The surgeon's eyes narrowed slightly, something in Rachel's tone, maybe, or the way she moved, the way her fingers found the surgical instruments without hesitation, but there was no time for questions. There was only the work. The lower abdominal wound was a 3-vessel catastrophe. The femoral artery was severed cleanly, bleeding bright arterial red in pulses that matched the flat line beeping on the anesthesia monitor before they got him stabilized. Rachel moved to the wound, her hands already knowing what they needed to do before her conscious mind caught up. The suction tip hissed as she cleared the field, the antiseptic smell thick enough to coat the back of her throat, and she could see the vessel beneath the muscle and tissue. The surgeon was calling out vitals like a cadence, BP 70/40, dropping. O2 sat 92, falling. Typing and crossing. Push another unit. The crash cart beside the operating table beeped its mechanical urgency, the anesthesiologist's fingers moving across the 4-pump like a pianist hitting the right notes. Rachel reached for a clamp, not the standard vascular clamp everyone expected, but a technique she'd learned in a field hospital at Bagram when the lights went out and the shelling started and you didn't have time to wait for sterile instruments. She bent 3 fingers of her left hand, using them as a natural 3-point pressure application against the bleeder, pinching the vessel at precise angles while her right hand worked to isolate the surrounding tissue. The bleeding slowed. Stopped. The field cleared. The color of the tissue brightened as blood flow returned. The surgical nurse beside her, Patricia, maybe 50, with surgical loops that magnified her eyes to owlish proportions, paused mid-suture. Her needle stopped. Her hand went motionless. She stared at Rachel's left hand, the way her 3 fingers held the pressure, the angle of her wrist, the pressure curve she was maintaining. Patricia's breath hitched. She set down her instrument slowly, deliberately, and leaned closer, close enough that Rachel could hear her breathing change, could feel the temperature shift in the small space between them. Patricia's voice, when she whispered, carried the weight of recognition so profound that Rachel felt it like a physical strike. You served. I used that exact method in Kandahar. 2012. 4th Combat Support Hospital. It wasn't a question. It wasn't accusation. It was confirmation, the way another operative recognizes a fellow operative, not from patches or credentials, but from the way hands moved under pressure, from muscle memory that ran deeper than training, from decisions made in milliseconds that only someone who'd been there would understand. Rachel's jaw tightened. Her hands didn't falter. The 3-finger clamp held steady, maintaining pressure as the surgeon moved in to ligate the vessel with sutures, as the anesthesiologist called out improving vitals, BP stabilizing at 85, O2 sat 96 and climbing as the monitors shifted from screaming danger to the steady beep of controlled recovery. Hold position, the trauma surgeon said, and Rachel held, her eyes locked on the field, refusing to meet Patricia's gaze, refusing to acknowledge that anything had changed. But everything had changed. The mask was cracking. 15 years of service, 3 tours, medals she couldn't mention, an operation she couldn't discuss, and she'd given it all away in 6 seconds of surgical instinct. The muscle memory didn't lie. The hands didn't forget. And the people who'd lived in those moments, the nurses who'd worked alongside her in hospitals under fire, the medics who'd learned the same techniques from the same instructors, the operators who'd all run the same playbook in the same combat zones, they recognized it immediately. The case took 48 minutes from incision to closure. Rachel worked through the entire procedure with the precision of someone operating on autopilot, her technical skill so refined that it required no conscious thought, leaving her mind free to spiral through the implications of exposure. Dr. Hayes called out her technique 3 times. Torres, how are you maintaining that pressure? / that's good. Nice work. / I've seen surgeons with 20 years in trauma who don't handle bleeders like that. Patricia said nothing else. She simply watched, her recognition absolute, her silence perhaps more damaging than any word she could have spoken. When they closed, when the chest tubes were placed and the dressing secured and the patient was wheeled toward recovery with vitals stable and prognosis suddenly, shockingly, possible, Patricia pulled off her surgical mask in the scrub room and looked directly at Rachel for the first time. Kandahar, Patricia said quietly. 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company, or Delta? The question was operational. Specific. She wasn't asking if Rachel had served, she was asking which unit, which area of operations, which specific war within the larger war. Rachel's hands moved automatically as she stripped off her gown, peeling away the latex like shedding skin, and she didn't answer. Couldn't answer. The classified protocols were absolute, no confirmation, no unit details, no timeline that could be triangulated. But her silence was an answer in itself. Patricia nodded slowly, understanding the constraints that operated in spaces beyond the hospital. Your secret's safe. I've been out since 2015, and the world moves on without us. But when you're ready to be something other than a temp, you let me know. Hospitals are always looking for nurses with your particular skill set. She walked past Rachel toward the exit, her footsteps hollow on the tile, and Rachel stood alone in the scrub room, staring at her reflection in the steel countertop. The person staring back was fraying at the edges. She returned to the ICU at 23:15 hours. The Admiral was sleeping, his vitals steady, the catheter lines running their gentle rhythm of fluids and medication. The ICU was quiet in that particular way of late night, when the unit's normal chaos settled into a lower frequency, fewer visitors, fewer admissions, the skeleton crew that kept the ship sailing while the rest of the world dreamed. Rachel checked every line, every dressing, every monitoring lead with the attention of someone who understood that her mission had just become exponentially more dangerous. If Patricia knew, others would know. Sooner or later, someone would ask the right question, or make the right connection, or speak the right name in the wrong room. Her cover identity, Rachel Torres, quiet temp nurse, nobody important, easily dismissed, was degrading in real time, and she had no extraction plan because the mission parameters hadn't accounted for exposure through surgical technique. She pulled her phone from her scrub pocket at 23:40 hours and typed a single message to a number that no longer existed in any database, mask compromised. Skill set identified by Delta-trained personnel. Assessment. The response came in 40 seconds, maintain position. Continue mission protocol. New parameters incoming. She closed the message, erased it, and stood in the medication room alone, her breath steady, her composure intact, even as the walls of her carefully constructed temporary life began to show the first cracks. 15 years of service. 3 combat tours. Dozens of operations that would never be declassified. And it would all unravel over surgical instinct, over hands that remembered Kandahar, over the moment a surgical nurse recognized something deeper than rank or uniform, she recognized sacrifice. That was the real problem. Sacrifice was visible to the people who'd made it. The stairwell door didn't just open. It exploded inward like a breech charge, metal shrieking against the frame, and Rachel's hands froze above Admiral Harrison's central line. The 0.6mm catheter hung suspended between her gloved fingers. 2 seconds of stillness. Then footsteps. Running. Heavy boots that didn't belong in a hospital where people wore creep soles and moved like ghosts through hallways designed for silence. She didn't look up. Training. The Admiral's eyes went wide. She moved without thinking, muscle memory taking over like a familiar weapon. The crash cart was 3 steps left. She grabbed it with one hand, her other hand still holding the sterile field, and started pushing the bed toward the bathroom with her hip. No hesitation. No second guessing. Just motion. Stay down, she whispered, not to the Admiral but to the moment itself, to the universe that had suddenly decided to collapse inward. The bed wheels squeaked, a sound like a rabbit dying, and she locked the bathroom door from inside, cranking the manual lock so hard her knuckles went white. Through the door, she heard them. 2 distinct voices. One shouting her patient's name. The other moving methodically, checking rooms, opening doors with the deliberate patience of people who had nowhere to be and all the time to wait. She stepped back into the hallway and closed the bathroom door behind her. The 2 men were 30 feet away, moving toward the Admiral's room from the north corridor. One carried a compact rifle. The other had his hand on something at his waist. Both wore dark jackets that hung wrong, weighted down by things that killed people. Dr. Mercer stood frozen outside his office. His face had gone the color of old bone. For one moment, just one, their eyes met. Then he turned and disappeared into his office, the door slamming with the sound of someone choosing which side of the divide they wanted to stand on. Rachel didn't move. She didn't reach for anything. Her mind catalogued the space in 3 seconds, the crash cart with its metal frame, the wall-mounted defibrillator on her left, the supply closet door with the lock she could pick in 5 seconds if she needed to. The distance to the gunman. The hallway geometry. The angles. The shadows that would give her cover for 4.2 seconds if she needed to move. She pushed the crash cart into the center of the hallway and positioned herself behind it. Not for cover. The metal frame wouldn't stop a rifle round. But it would slow them down by 3 seconds, and 3 seconds was how long it took to get security moving. Her phone was already in her hand. She'd pressed the silent alarm 30 seconds before the door breached, the moment she heard that unnatural sound. Cedar Creek Medical Security, this is dispatch, a voice crackled through her earpiece. We have your location, ICU North. Units responding. 2 armed subjects, ICU hallway, hunting for Admiral Harrison, Rachel said, her voice steady as a landing gear. I have the patient secured. They're moving north. The first gunman saw her. He raised his rifle and Rachel had 3 seconds to understand what was about to happen. She'd had longer during Kandahar. She'd had maybe 4 seconds when the RPG hit the convoy. She'd had 2 seconds when the IED detonated outside the clinic in Loga province. Time compressed differently when your body knew it was running out. She didn't try to run. The first round hit her shoulder like being struck with a sledgehammer made of burning metal. The impact spun her backward and she felt the joint dislocate, felt the cartilage separate, felt physics and biology conspiring to shut her body down. She stayed upright. The crash cart was her anchor. Her left arm went numb. Hospital security, stand down, she called out, her voice not wavering because Marines didn't waver and neither did Navy captains, and the fact that she was bleeding was just data, just information that her body was still processing. The second round caught her lower abdomen, right of center, and she felt the bullet separate her organs the way a key separates a lock. She dropped to one knee but kept her hand on the cart. The pain wasn't pain yet, it was shock, it was adrenaline, it was the body's denial screaming louder than the wound itself. 2 minutes out, the dispatch voice said, "Stay on the line." The second gunman was moving now, moving around her, trying to get to the bathroom where Admiral Harrison was locked behind a door that had a standard hospital lock, the kind that opened with a plastic card from any housekeeping closet. Rachel pushed the crash cart toward him. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't tactical. It was just a heavy piece of hospital equipment with 4 poles and monitor cables and 400 pounds of desperate momentum. The gunman had to choose between standing his ground or jumping back, and his body chose jumping back, which meant 3 more seconds. 3 more seconds for the fluorescent lights overhead to buzz their mechanical song. 3 more seconds for Rachel to reach into the supply drawer behind her and find the trauma shears without looking. Her phone was still in her hand. She pressed 911 directly this time, speaking past the shock that was beginning to settle into her chest like fog rolling across water. Officer needs assistance, Cedar Creek Medical, ICU North, 2 armed subjects, officer down, she caught herself. Civilian. She was civilian here. Multiple GSWs, officer status, immediate assistance. The gunmen were moving back now. They could hear the sirens. Raleigh PD ran 4.2 minutes average response time from dispatch, but the hospital had its own security detail, and those boots were coming up the stairwell with sounds like thunder. Rachel's right leg wasn't working anymore. The 3rd bullet had entered her thigh just below the hip flexor, nicking the femoral artery in the way that made blood pool instead of spurt, the way that gave you maybe 10 minutes if you were lucky and trained and knew exactly what to do. She applied pressure with her right hand while holding her phone in her left, her body doing the work her mind had learned 15 years ago in places that didn't exist on any map. The tourniquet was in her pocket. It always was. She'd installed it that morning at 0530 hours before anyone arrived, a simple Cat 7-inch strap wrapped around her quad, waiting. Her hands moved on their own, deploying the tourniquet above the wound, cranking it until the bleeding stopped being a river and became a trickle, became bearable, became survivable. Behind his office door, Dr. Mercer was making phone calls. Rachel heard his voice through the walls. The acoustic properties of hospital construction meant sound traveled through the ventilation system like gossip through a break room. He was speaking to someone important. Someone with the kind of authority that made him sit up straighter even while his career was dying. Dr. Harrison's presence created an unsafe environment, Mercer was saying, his words coming fast, tumbling over each other like someone building a house out of cards before the wind blew them away. Possible PTSD-related episode. She antagonized individuals who became violent as a result of her behavior. The incident is entirely her fault. I have documentation of her insubordination. Multiple witnesses. I tried to address her mental health concerns, but she became increasingly unstable. The lies were beautiful, Rachel thought distantly. The lies were so carefully constructed they were almost art. He was calling the hospital board president. She could hear the man's voice through the phone, shocked, asking questions. Then Mercer called the state medical inspector. Then his malpractice attorney. Then the credentialing committee. For phone calls. For separate narratives, each one more polished than the last, each one bending Rachel's actions into the shape of instability, paranoia, mental illness, the kind of things that would stick to her record like tar even after the truth came out. Even after the bullets were removed and the wounds were closed and the bleeding stopped. The sirens were outside now. She could hear them screaming through Raleigh's 0215-hour silence, tearing through the sleeping city like an alarm for something far worse than a shooting. Security flooded the hallway. Then police. Then a trauma team that looked at her wounds and started moving in that organized chaos that meant they understood exactly what she'd done and exactly how much time was left. One of the officers looked at her bloodied hands. "How long?" he asked. 15 minutes, Rachel said. Maybe 20 if the femoral's partial. He understood what she meant. He was old enough, experienced enough, to recognize the language of someone who'd been trained to calculate her own survival in real time. They moved her to a gurney. They cut away her scrubs. The trauma bay was a cathedral of fluorescent light and beeping machines and the particular smell of blood mixing with antiseptic, and Rachel noticed, the way she always noticed, that the team moving around her was efficient and practiced and had no idea they were working on someone who'd been shot before, who'd sewn herself back together with a field knife in a dusty compound 7,300 miles from here. "Captain," a resident said, checking her pupils. "Can you hear me?" Rachel blinked twice. She heard the word echo through her body, "Captain," and understood that it had escaped somehow. Someone had said it aloud. The mask had cracked just enough for the truth to show through, like blood seeping through gauze. But that didn't matter now. None of it mattered now. What mattered was the 4 lines sliding into her arm and the saline running and the pressure being applied and the machines announcing in their electronic voices that her body was still doing the things bodies do when they're trying to survive. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she could still hear Dr. Mercer's voice, still hear him on the phone with the board president, constructing his narrative with the careful precision of someone whose entire career depended on making himself right and Rachel wrong, on turning her salvation into her destruction. 3 hours later, when the bleeding had stopped and the stitches had been placed and Rachel lay in a patient bed instead of standing at one, a HR director with a folder came to find her. The termination notice was already signed. The clock on the ICU wall read 0340 when Rachel's eyes opened to the beep of her own heart monitor. Fluorescent strips cast everything in sickly white, her bandaged shoulder, the 4-line tape to her left wrist, the surgical dressings already showing seepage from the 3 wounds that had torn through muscle and intent alike. Her abdomen ached with the particular clarity of fresh stitches. Her thigh, wrapped in compression bandaging, throbbed in rhythm with her pulse. She didn't move. The room was cold enough that she could see the edge of her breath, and the ventilation system hissed like a predator learning to breathe underwater. This was pain as information, readable, quantifiable, survivable. She'd extracted a bullet from her own shoulder in Kandahar with less medical support than what was currently flowing through her fore. What she noticed first was that Dr. Mercer never came. In a normal hospital world, a physician checks on their patients after midnight, especially a patient with fresh trauma, especially a patient with 3 gunshot wounds absorbed while protecting another person in the building. The standard protocol was routine vitals, wound assessment, pain medication review, documentation. But Mercer's rounds never reached her room. Rachel tracked the sounds of the ICU, footsteps passing, the squeak of a crash cart being restocked, a nurse calling for supplies down the hallway. Not once did his voice materialize. Not once did his shadow cross her doorway. By 0600, she understood. He wasn't checking on her because he was busy rewriting her. Downstairs, in conference rooms and over secure phone lines, her narrative was being constructed like an evidence board pinned with lies. The phone calls he'd made before her stretcher left the ICU were investments in a story: Rachel Torres, unstable temp nurse, military fantasy complex, violent episode triggered by real patients who had no idea they were walking into danger. The HR director arrived at 0740 with a manila folder that looked heavier than it should. Rachel was sitting up by then, the morning light coming through the hospital window in long bars that made her squint. Her right arm was immobilized in a sling. Her left hand could still grip, still sign, still acknowledge what was coming. The folder slid onto the bedside table with the weight of administrative finality. Inside, her termination notice, dated 0600 this morning, signed by 3 separate people who'd never watched her work. The reason printed in red, creating an unsafe environment for staff and patients. The termination was effective immediately. Her badge access would be revoked within the hour. Her name would be removed from the rotation by end of day. Separate lines noted that she was being referred to the State Nursing Board for investigation and that Cedar Creek Medical was conducting a full review of her medical decision-making during her tenure. The folder contained no mention of Admiral Harrison's survival. No mention of the 2 men who had breached the ICU with weapons. No mention of her absorbing 3 rounds of ammunition with her body. Just the narrative Mercer had built: a destabilized nurse, a security threat, a problem solved. Rachel didn't sign the termination. She didn't protest it. She just set the folder on the table and asked the HR director to close the door softly on her way out. By 1000 hours, a nurse she didn't recognize came to remove her for, not the standard slow infusion, but all at once, efficient and impersonal. No one explained what this meant. No one said goodbye. Rachel understood that she was being processed out, her presence becoming a liability with every hour she remained. Her handlers would be reading the same report Mercer had filed. Her cover identity, the one she'd maintained for 18 months, was fraying like wet rope. The classified medical observation mission, her whole reason for being here, the Admiral's recovery data she'd been collecting in weekly encrypted reports, was now compromised. If Cedar Creek Medical was launching an internal investigation, federal eyes could follow. If nurses started talking about her military background, if that surgical nurse Patricia ever mentioned the combat medic clamp technique, the dots would connect faster than any encryption could hide them. The laundry room was on the basement level, a long space lined with industrial washers and industrial dryers, the air thick with bleach and steam. Rachel had borrowed a wheelchair from the supply closet because walking made her abdomen pull apart at the stitches, and moving was what she did when she needed to think. The scrubs she'd worn during her last shift were in a mesh bag at her feet, the one she'd removed in the ER after the gunshot wounds, before the surgery, before everything collapsed. She was folding them with her right hand, making a mess of it, the fabric stubborn and heavy. One screw up and she was benched entirely. One exposure of her military background and her entire service record became evidence in a criminal investigation. The Admiral's care would be handed off to someone without her clearance level, without her knowledge of what kind of damage Bagram inflicted on a human body. She found the patch while folding the second shirt. Navy SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, the insignia faded to something barely visible, sewn into the lining of her jacket 15 years ago when she was still the person the patch represented. She'd never removed it. Carrying it had felt like carrying proof, like carrying 15 years of operations that no one would ever know about, saves that would never appear in any record. She held the patch with her good hand, feeling the rough stitching her mother had done before Rachel deployed the first time. "So you never forget where you come from," her mother had said, threading the needle by lamplight. Rachel hadn't forgotten. She'd just buried it under layers of temp work and humiliation and the particular grace of staying invisible in a world that despised people like her, people who'd seen the worst and somehow still wanted to help. The patch shook in her trembling hand. But it wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the specific muscle tension that came from knowing her entire life was about to be uprooted again, a new cover identity assembled, a new hospital in a new city where she'd start from zero. She'd done it before. She could do it again. What made the shaking almost unbearable was knowing that Admiral Harrison was still upstairs, still healing, still unaware that the person who'd saved his life was about to be extracted and disappeared. Her phone buzzed at 1,147 hours. No caller ID, just the secure encrypted channel her handlers used. 3 words, extraction window 1800. Package ready. It meant her new identity was assembled. It meant she had 6 hours to leave Cedar Creek Medical, leave Raleigh, leave the Admiral's recovery in someone else's hands. It meant everything she'd built here was being burned down for security purposes. She texted back, "Confirm status Admiral Harrison." The response came in 47 seconds, "Not your mission anymore. Complying with standard protocol. New assignment briefing upon arrival. Prepare for extraction." Rachel set her phone down. She folded the last scrub shirt with the patch still visible in her lap, and for the first time in 18 months of living as a temporary nurse, she let herself acknowledge what she'd lost. Not the mission. Not the cover. But the particular kind of peace that came from helping someone without needing recognition for it. From being invisible. From being useful in a way that didn't require anyone to know her name. The sound of boots on concrete made her look up. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was when the boots stopped walking and started running. The worst part was when she heard radio traffic crackling through the basement levels, words like Admiral, words like Federal, words like mobilization, words that meant something had shifted in the 3 hours since her termination notice was signed. Above her, somewhere in the hospital's communication systems, something was happening that she wasn't being told about. Something that was about to change everything about why she was sitting in a laundry room folding scrubs at 1,147 hours on a Tuesday morning with her life about to be extracted into shadow. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was the emergency broadcast system alert her handlers used only for operational cascades. One line, NSC alert flagged your security clearance. Naval Special Warfare Command aware. Stand by for modified extraction protocol. Rachel sat very still. The washing machines churned around her. The dryers tumbled with the sound of cotton and time running out. And somewhere above this basement, in the ICU where Admiral Harrison lay recovering from bagram wounds that she understood in ways no regular physician could, the entire structure of military command was mobilizing to figure out why a temp nurse at Cedar Creek Medical had a classified security clearance and a history of saving lives that the official record would never acknowledge. She had 3 hours. 3 hours before extraction. 3 hours before she became someone else entirely. 3 hours before Admiral Harrison found out who she really was, or before he never found out at all. Stay subscribed for the final segment where Admiral Harrison's entire Navy unit arrives at Cedar Creek Medical, where Rachel's true identity is revealed to everyone who tried to destroy her, and where Dr. Mercer finally realizes exactly who he tried to take down. Like this video if you believe heroes walk among us wearing scrubs, and comment, what would you do if the Pentagon showed up at your workplace?